There's something absolutely crucial about spiritual awakening that most gurus, motivational speakers, and superficial teachers will never tell you. They avoid this truth because it introduces necessary caution, discipline, and respect into a process they prefer to present as purely blissful, simple, and immediately rewarding. Carl Jung, the monumental figure of 20th century psychology, discovered this secret truth, this necessary, dark, and challenging side of transformation, through decades of intensive clinical practice, and more critically, through his own harrowing personal journey into the depths of his unconscious, which he meticulously documented in his famous private work, The Red Book. He didn't just study transformation, he lived through a profound psychological collapse and rebirth. He found that awakening doesn't just expand your consciousness, it is a profound and violent destabilization of your entire psychological structure. And if you approach it without the proper knowledge, preparation, and profound respect for the primal forces you are unleashing, you risk devastating self-destruction, falling into neurosis or worse. He called this entire process the confrontation with the unconscious, and he believed it contained genuine, serious, and quantifiable risks that everyone on the spiritual path needs to understand deeply. These aren't minor philosophical obstacles. These are potential psychological catastrophes that can derail a life for decades, leading to chronic neurosis, full-blown psychosis, or total stagnation, leaving the individual stranded between two worlds. Today, I'm revealing the 5 hidden psychological dangers Jung identified in spiritual awakening. This isn't meant to discourage your journey, but rather to serve as a vital, high-resolution map, a detailed psychological compass, to help you navigate it safely, consciously, and with both courage and prudence, because Jung discovered that the difference between genuine, lasting transformation and a debilitating psychological crisis often comes down entirely to understanding these specific risks and knowing precisely how to work with them through integration and conscious mediation. Here's the radical truth Jung understood that changes everything. Spiritual awakening is not a gentle ascent into light. It is a process that activates powerful psychological forces, the symbols and primal urges, into the fragile rational structure of the conscious ego. The ego, which built itself on logic, routine, and order, finds itself completely submerged by this torrent of chaos, and its foundations begin to crumble. This flooding is the moment of crisis, where the ego risks being completely dissolved or, conversely, desperately overreacting. He spent his entire career developing the essential maps and frameworks to navigate these turbulent waters safely, emphasizing that the ego must mature and act as a sophisticated filter and mediator between the inner and outer worlds, not merely a passive, overwhelmed recipient. The first danger is already affecting countless people who sincerely believe they are awakening. It's what Jung called the concretization of symbols. This is the psychological mistake of taking inner psychological and spiritual experiences literally rather than symbolically. When powerful inner experiences, such as intense dreams, visions, or energetic shifts, are tragically misunderstood as concrete, external, objective reality, the awakening process can become deeply confusing, completely ungrounded, and ultimately destabilizing, leading directly to delusion and a complete loss of orientation. It's the fatal error of confusing the highly complex metaphor for the manifest reality. It's like believing the name of a person is the entire person, or confusing the abstract mathematical formula for a perfect sphere with the physical, imperfect, slightly dented bowling ball in your hand. Here is what actually happens during an intense awakening. The unconscious, which is vast, ancient, and speaks in the language of myth, produces powerful symbols, visions, and intense energy experiences. You might dream of divine figures, Feel intense, unfamiliar energy moving through your body, often interpreted as Kundalini activation, or have vivid visions of spiritual realms, past lives, or mythical creatures. Jung discovered these are not external visitations. They are symbolic communications from your own unconscious mind, profoundly meaningful because they point toward the self and the path of individuation. But they are not literal, objective facts that exist outside of your psyche. They are the language of the deeper psyche, expressed in myth and image. And they must be delusion, leading the individual to chase external validation for an internal experience. This danger manifests in specific, recognizable ways that often look like spiritual ego in public, but are actually signs of psychological disintegration. Someone experiences a powerful dream of being chosen by divine forces and believes they are literally a chosen prophet, a grandiose delusion that replaces humility and disciplined effort rather than understanding it symbolically represents their own emerging potential and the call to individuation. They feel intense energy surges in their body and instantly believe they are developing supernatural powers or siddhis, a severe form of spiritual inflation, rather than recognizing natural, albeit intense, psychophysiological processes that accompany deep change. They have powerful visions of past lives and take them as literal history, a confusion of collective memory or deeply repressed trauma with factual biography, rather than symbolic representations of deep, recurring, unconscious patterns that need to be resolved now in this lifetime. What makes this particularly challenging is that these experiences feel completely real, often more real, intense, and vivid than ordinary waking life, because they are saturated with the primordial energy of the unconscious. The sheer energetic intensity is part of the mechanism by which the unconscious forces the ego to pay attention. But Jung emphasized the crucial importance of symbolic thinking, understanding these experiences as profound metaphors rather than literal facts. This requires a sophisticated, mature ego that can hold the tension of the unknown without collapsing into certainty. Jung taught that when you encounter a powerful spiritual event, you should ask not, "Is this literally true? Is this entity physically real and speaking to me from outside?" But, "What is this symbolizing about my psychological process? What is the hidden meaning that my conscious mind needs to integrate to become whole?" A vision of dying and being reborn isn't literal death, but symbolic of necessary psychological transformation and the transition to a new, mature phase of life. Meeting a wise guide in meditation isn't encountering an external entity, but connecting with your own inner wisdom, the wise old man or great mother archetype, a universal reservoir of collective.
We understand experiences symbolically and avoid delusion. Another subtle, pervasive danger emerges: the regressive restoration of the persona. This is the powerful, almost irresistible temptation to retreat into an even more rigid, hardened version of who you were before, when the challenges of awakening become genuinely overwhelming. This isn't just taking a healthy step back to integrate. It's a deep psychological armoring, a fierce, primitive, defensive maneuver by the threatened ego that can block all future growth for years, or even decades. The ego chooses stasis and death over the terrifying uncertainty of transformation. Here's why this is so dangerous. Spiritual awakening demands that you dismantle your false self, the persona, the social mask you wear. Confront your deepest moral and psychological flaws, your shadow, and experience temporary psychological chaos, a kind of spiritual dismemberment. This process is inherently terrifying. When this necessary process becomes too intense, the psyche's survival mechanism can trigger what Jung termed defensive crystallization, a rapid, panicked rebuilding and reinforcement of old, limiting patterns, often stronger, more brittle, and more resistant to change than they were before the process began. Jung wrote, The danger is not that awakening will fail, but that it will trigger such defensive consolidation that future attempts at transformation become nearly impossible. The psyche, once burned by premature opening, creates rigid barriers that can take years of painful effort to dissolve. This reaction is often driven by the primitive fear of the dissolution of identity itself. The initial terror of the unknown is tragically replaced by the suffocating comfort of the known, even if the known is fundamentally destructive to the potential of the self. This defensive return manifests in recognizable patterns that demonstrate a psychological snapback. The person begins awakening, encounters their shadow, or experiences the uncomfortable dissolving of the ego, becomes intensely frightened, and suddenly becomes more rigid, cynical, and aggressively materialistic than before. The former spiritual seeker who glimpsed oneness suddenly becomes aggressively boundaried and separate, obsessed with control, status, and external security as a shield against inner chaos. The one who started questioning everything becomes fundamentalist about psychological trick, where the ego uses the very energy of awakening to build stronger defenses against it. This regression is often rationalized as being practical, growing up, or returning to reality. In truth, it is running away from the hard work of becoming whole. The key to avoiding this danger requires what Jung called graduated awakening, taking the process slowly, integrating each tiny piece of insight and experience fully before attempting to move forward. Think of it this way. It's precisely like deep-sea diving. Ascending too quickly causes the bends, a painful, dangerous pressure in the body due to unintegrated nitrogen. In psychological terms, expanding consciousness too rapidly causes defensive psychological collapse. The key is recognizing that a temporary retreat to consolidate gains is healthy and necessary. But when stepping back becomes building impenetrable walls of denial and rigidity, you are in profound danger of stagnation. Even when we avoid the defensive retreat and maintain momentum, another danger awaits: spiritual inflation without grounding. Jung discovered a pervasive danger where people become so exclusively identified with transcendent experiences, with the archetypal power of the self, that they completely lose connection with practical life, the body, and basic human responsibilities. They absorb the feeling of infinite possibility and divine unity from the unconscious, but because their conscious ego isn't strong enough or humble enough to contain this cosmic energy, they become psychologically puffed up with a false sense of superiority. They literally float away from the earth while genuinely believing they are ascending to heaven or have achieved a state beyond the mundane. Here's what creates this dangerous imbalance. Authentic awakening often brings experiences of expansion, transcendence, and unity that feel infinitely more meaningful, more beautiful, and more real than ordinary life. The powerful temptation is to pursue only these peak experiences, chasing the high of unity and ego dissolution, while aggressively neglecting what Jung called the equally sacred ground of everyday existence, the realm of matter, relationships, work, and the body. This imbalance creates a profound psychological instability that inevitably leads to a practical life collapse. Responsible life structure. This ungrounding manifests in specific, well-documented ways that look like spiritual progress, but are actually psychological dissociation. People intensely neglect their physical health while pursuing spiritual heights. Seeing the body as a mere hindrance or illusion to be overcome, they abandon practical responsibilities, work, committed relationships, finances, considering them unspiritual concerns that are beneath their awakened state. They lose the ability to engage with ordinary life, finding everything except peak spiritual experiences completely meaningless and boring. This creates what Jung called pseudo-transcendence,
a dissociated, inflated state that mimics enlightenment, but is actually a form of deep psychological fragmentation and irresponsibility. Jung identified clear signs of this: inability to maintain stable employment or living situations, dismissing practical concerns as illusions while suffering real-world consequences, and what Jung called spiritual bypassing, using elevated transcendent ideas to completely avoid dealing with messy, painful, concrete psychological issues like unresolved trauma or interpersonal conflict. The body suffers, the career suffers, and relationships are shattered by the ego's newfound fragile grandiosity. Jung emphasized that genuine spiritual development requires the union of opposites: transcendence and embodiment, spirit and matter, heaven and earth. The ultimate goal is not to escape the human condition, but to bring the divine into it. The key to avoiding this danger is what Jung called conscious embodiment, deliberately grounding spiritual insights in practical daily life. This means honoring the body as a sacred vessel, treating daily responsibilities as a spiritual practice, and maintaining the essential balance of feet on the ground, head in the stars. The cosmic must be brought down and integrated at the dinner table, in the office, and in relationships where its true value is tested. Even when a person maintains grounding and avoids inflation, another subtle, agonizing danger can arise: arrested dissolution. This is the challenging point where the necessary breakdown that precedes breakthrough gets stuck, leaving someone in a state of perpetual psychological dissolution without any reformation.
Who they were, nor who they are becoming. They are perpetually disassembled, living in the ruins of their former personality, unable to build anything new. Jung wrote, "The dissolution phase of transformation is meant to be temporary, a passage, not a residence. When it becomes permanent, the person exists in a state of perpetual psychological crisis without hope of resolution. They are like a house that has been demolished, but for which no new foundation has been laid. The person has heroically dismantled their old map, but has not yet received a new compass or new tools, and remains desperately lost and powerless in the psychological wilderness. This arrested dissolution manifests in debilitating ways: chronic, agonizing emptiness that is not the fertile void of transformation, but a barren psychological wasteland. Ongoing identity confusion, often bordering on depersonalization. Loss of the fundamental ability to make decisions, form stable relationships, or engage with life, not from conscious choice, but from profound psychological inability, like a car with no engine. This state can be tragically mistaken for spiritual progress. The ego dissolution feels like the ego death described in texts. The emptiness seems like Buddhist emptiness, or sunyata. But Jung distinguished these states sharply. Healthy development involves dissolution, followed immediately by integration and the emergence of the self. Arrested dissolution is psychological fragmentation without resolution. It is a failure to complete the cycle. Jung identified several factors that can cause this arrest: moving too quickly, the presence of deeply repressed trauma that is activated by the dissolution, lack of proper guidance, or underlying psychological fragility, which turns transformation into a cycle of re-traumatization and chronic breakdown. The subjective experience is one of continuous, unresolvable psychic pain. Jung called this the torture of perpetual becoming without being. Jung emphasized that this danger requires active intervention and rarely resolves spontaneously. The person needs skilled guidance, often professional Jungian analysis, to complete the arrested process and rebuild the necessary psychological structures. The key to avoiding arrested dissolution to ordinary consciousness ordinary life, or ordinary conversation, leading to profound, intense loneliness. It is the necessary solitude of the mountain peak. Authentic awakening fundamentally changes your psychological structure. You see differently, feel differently, and value differently. What Jung called the problem of the awakened is that this difference creates an almost unbridgeable gulf between you and those still operating from conventional, collective consciousness. You have become an integrated individual. They remain part of the collective mind, bound by its illusions and norms. Jung wrote, "The individuated person faces a particular form of isolation, not from failure but from success. Having achieved psychological integration, they find few who can meet them at their level of development, and their insights make them profoundly different from the people around them. They possess a clarity that is often unwelcome and misunderstood by the majority. It is the price paid for rising above the collective norms, and the experience is often one of deep solitude and alienation. This isolation manifests in painful ways. Conversations feel hollow because others cannot engage with the depths you now inhabit. Social situations feel artificial because you can no longer participate authentically in the collective unconsciousness of small talk, gossip, and convention without feeling manipulative or dishonest. You understand others, their shadow, their persona, their projections, but you feel fundamentally, deeply misunderstood, like an anthropologist in a foreign land who knows the language but not the soul of the people. Jung compared it to an adult trying to engage meaningfully with children's games. You can participate superficially, with empathy, but you can't genuinely engage at that level because you've developmentally moved beyond it. The isolation extends to life choices. Your values have shifted so fundamentally that conventional goals, the pursuit of status, wealth for its own sake, or social dominance, seem utterly meaningless. Jung observed that many awakened individuals experience what he called the burden of consciousness. Seeing clearly brings immense responsibility and often deep pain. You see the suffering and unconscious patterns others are trapped in, the illusions they cling to.
Insights through creative work or teaching, or simply by accepting the isolation as a profound part of your journey, while still maintaining human warmth and empathy for the struggles of the collective. The goal is to be alone, but not lonely, to be separate, but connected by compassion. Here's complete, critical picture of awakening's hidden dangers. Concretization. Mistaking potent inner symbols for literal external reality and falling into delusion. Regressive restoration, retreating into an even more rigid, hardened version of the old self, the persona, out of fear of collapse. Spiritual inflation, losing grounding and practical life connection, while exclusively seeking transcendence, leading to grandiosity and life collapse. Arrested dissolution, getting stuck in perpetual psychological breakdown, turning necessary transformation into chronic crisis. Isolation, becoming separate from ordinary humanity due to profound psychological differentiation and the burden of consciousness. These aren't reasons to avoid awakening, but essential realities to navigate consciously and with extreme caution. Jung wrote, "The dangers of individuation are real, but so is the danger of not individuating. The risk of awakening must be weighed against the certainty of sleeping through life, which is the greater and more tragic danger. Understanding these dangers is your absolute best protection. You are simply discovering why Jung called individuation the most difficult, most important, and most necessary journey a human can undertake."